Most people imagine the time of Jesus like this: sandals, sermons, miracles, a quiet, spiritual world, far removed from real life. But for the people who actually lived there, daily life wasn't defined by theology. It was defined by money, or more accurately, by the absence of it. The world Jesus was born into was one of the most economically unequal systems the ancient Mediterranean had ever produced. This wasn't background scenery, this was the engine of the story. Welcome to a world where money, power, and history collide. And nothing is ever as simple as it looks. At the beginning of the 1st century, Judea existed inside the Roman Empire. But Rome wasn't a modern state. It wasn't trying to integrate territories. It was the most efficient extraction machine the world had ever seen. Rome didn't conquer lands to develop them. It conquered them to feed the center. The edges of the empire existed for one reason: to move wealth inward. Grain, silver, human labor, all flowing from the margins toward Rome. Judea was one of those margins, and that mattered because Judea wasn't rich. It was rural, agricultural, fragile. Most people lived off the land, but not in the modern sense of farming. They worked plots just large enough to survive. A bad harvest didn't mean lower profits, it meant hunger, and Rome didn't care. Rome governed Judea through a mix of local elites and imperial officials. Kings like Herod ruled with Roman approval. After his death, Roman prefects like Pontius Pilate took over. Their job wasn't to raise living standards, it was to maintain order and keep revenue flowing. Taxes were the backbone of the system, and this is where it gets uncomfortable. Today we think of taxes as something tied to income or profit. In Judea, taxes were owed regardless of outcome. You paid because you existed. Land taxes, produce taxes, head taxes, tolls on roads and markets, and on top of all that, religious taxes. Miss a payment and consequences were immediate. There was no appeals process, no safety net. Tax collection was outsourced to contractors, tax farmers, who paid Rome up front for the right to collect. Everything they squeezed beyond that was profit. Abuse wasn't a flaw in the system, it was the incentive. If you couldn't pay, you borrowed. Debt was everywhere, but this wasn't modern debt. There was no bankruptcy, no restructuring, no protection. Interest accumulated fast. Land was the collateral. One bad year could trap a family in a downward spiral with no escape. It usually worked like this. A farmer plants, the weather turns, the harvest fails. Taxes are still due, the farmer borrows, interest grows. The next year barely recovers, but the debt remains. Eventually, the land is seized. The farmer becomes a tenant on his own former property, or a laborer, or disappears entirely. This wasn't an accident, it was structural. Over time, land consolidated into fewer hands. Small plots vanished, large estates expanded, wealth clustered around elites tied to Rome and temple authority. The majority sank into permanent insecurity. The economy didn't just create poverty, it reproduced it. There was no safety net. Lose your land and there was no unemployment support, no welfare, no public housing. Family was the only buffer. Community charity existed, but it was limited. When too many people fell at once, the system offered nothing. Debt wasn't just financial, it was social. Losing land meant losing status, losing identity, losing the future, a drought, a tax hike, a single missed payment. Any one of them could erase a family line. This is the world Jesus was born into. And it's important to be clear about this. People weren't poor because they were lazy, or immoral, or cursed. They were poor because the system required them to be. Rome needed surplus. Local elites needed rent. The temple needed revenue. All that pressure landed on people with the least margin for error. And this produced something else, tension. Judea wasn't quiet. It was volatile. Rebellions flared constantly. Banditry wasn't just crime, it was economic desperation. Messianic movements don't emerge in comfort, they emerge in collapse. This is where modern audiences often miss the point. When people heard sermons about debt forgiveness, they didn't hear metaphors, they heard survival. When they heard about the poor, it wasn't abstract compassion, it was their neighbors, their families, themselves. Forgiveness didn't just mean emotional relief, it meant debt cancellation, release, escape. And escape was rare. The Roman system was efficient, not humane. It prioritized stability over fairness, revenue over lives. People worked harder and fell further behind. Productivity didn't bring security. Growth lifted a few and sank the rest. Everyone knew it. No one believed the system was fair. No one believed hard work guaranteed safety. There was only endurance, resentment, and hope that something, anything, might break the cycle. And that's when ideas become dangerous, because when a system is this tight, even words feel revolutionary. By the time Jesus began speaking publicly, the pressure was already unbearable. The audience was ready. The fractures were visible. This wasn't context. This was the engine. To understand why the economy felt inescapable, you have to look at the institution people believed was meant to protect them, the temple. Today, we imagine the temple as purely religious, but economically it was one of the most powerful institutions in the region. It was sacred and it was financial, a treasury, a bank, a tax authority, a court. Every adult Jewish male was required to pay a yearly temple tax. In a specific silver coin, local currency wasn't accepted, Roman coins weren't accepted, money had to be exchanged for a fee. Animals for sacrifice were sold at temple-approved prices. If you were poor, you didn't escape the system. You paid less. But you still paid. Religion didn't replace Roman taxation. It stacked on top of it. And the temple elite were deeply intertwined with Roman power. High priests were appointed with Roman approval. Stability mattered more than righteousness. This created a contradiction people couldn't ignore. The temple preached holiness and forgiveness, but its operations reinforced debt and exclusion. Access to God required payment, and people noticed Jesus didn't speak outside this system, he spoke directly into it. When he talked about debt, people heard economics. When he talked about release, they heard relief. When he talked about the kingdom of God, they heard an alternative order. And then came the moment that changed everything, the disruption in the temple. When Jesus overturned the tables of the money changers, it wasn't just religious outrage, it was economic confrontation. He called it a den of robbers. That crossed a line. Rome tolerated teachers, it tolerated critics. What it didn't tolerate was instability. And temple authorities knew unrest during Passover was dangerous. From their perspective, Jesus wasn't just preaching, he was disrupting flows, challenging legitimacy. The conflict wasn't primarily theological, it was economic and political. Because once people stop accepting debt as destiny, extraction becomes harder to enforce. Judea was a pressure cooker. Taxes, debt, land loss, religious obligation, political repression. Revolt wasn't a question of if, but when. Rome responded the only way it ever did. What followed wasn't reform, it was escalation. Within a generation, Judea exploded into open rebellion. By the year 70, Jerusalem was under siege. The temple was destroyed stone by stone, its treasury looted, its elite erased. Rome didn't just suppress dissent, it dismantled the infrastructure of resistance. But here's what people often miss. The destruction of the temple didn't end extraction, it streamlined it. Taxation intensified, land consolidation accelerated, debt became less visible and more absolute. Rome won control of territory, but it never fully regained control of meaning. Jesus wasn't leading an army, he wasn't writing tax policy. That's exactly why his impact can't be measured by regime change. What he challenged wasn't Rome's power to extract, it was the moral logic that made extraction feel inevitable and divinely justified. By separating debt from moral failure, by offering forgiveness without institutional payment, by placing the poor at the center rather than the margins, he destabilized something Rome depended on as much as legions: legitimacy. Empires can survive suffering. They struggle when people stop believing suffering is necessary. After the temple fell, the system Jesus criticized didn't disappear, but neither did his critique. Rome crushed armed rebellion easily. It always did. But this kind of challenge was harder to kill. It moved with people. It survived loss. And over time, something unexpected happened. Rome didn't eliminate this alternative framework. It absorbed it. And in doing so, it quietly admitted something profound. Authority could no longer rest on force alone. Moral credibility mattered. The economy of Jesus' time reveals an uncomfortable truth. Systems don't collapse simply because they are unjust. They collapse when the stories that justify them stop working. Rome optimized extraction, but it never repaired the moral fracture beneath it. And that's the deeper lesson. Economic systems wrapped in moral language are incredibly durable. They survive hardship. They survive resentment. They even survive rebellion. What they don't survive is widespread disbelief. The moment people stop believing suffering is necessary, deserved, or meaningful, history seems harder to understand than we think. But it is not, let me clear for you.